She fell asleep. The next morning she was down early. Mrs. Dent, who kept no servants, was busily preparing breakfast. "Don't Agnes help you about breakfast?" asked Rebecca. "No, I let her lay," replied Mrs. Dent shortly. "What time did she get home last night?" "She didn't get home." "What?" "She didn't get home. She stayed with Addie. She often does." "Without sending you word?" "Oh, she knew I wouldn't worry." "When will she be home?" "Oh, I guess she'll be along pretty soon." Rebecca was uneasy, but she tried to conceal it, for she knew of no good reason for uneasiness. What was there to occasion alarm in the fact of one young girl staying overnight with another? She could not eat much breakfast. Afterward, she went out on the little piazza, although her hostess strove furtively to stop her. "Why don't you go out back of the house? It's real pretty, a view over the river," she said. "I guess I'll go out here," replied Rebecca. She had a purpose: to watch for the absent girl. Presently, Rebecca came hustling into the house through the sitting room into the kitchen where Mrs. Dent was cooking. "That rose bush!" she gasped. Mrs. Dent turned and faced her. "What of it?" "It's a blowing." "What of it?" "There isn't a mite of wind this morning." Mrs. Dent turned with an inimitable toss of her fair head. "If you think I can spend my time puzzling over such nonsense as—" she began, but Rebecca interrupted her with a cry and a rush to the door. "There she is now!" she cried. She flung the door wide open, and curiously enough a breeze came in, and her own gray hair tossed, and a paper blew off the table to the floor with a loud rustle. But there was nobody in sight. "There's nobody here," Rebecca said. She looked blankly at the other woman, who brought her rolling pin down on a slab of pie crust with a thud. "I didn't hear anybody," she said calmly. "I saw somebody pass that window." "You were mistaken again." "I know I saw somebody." "You couldn't have. Please shut that door." Rebecca shut the door. She sat down beside the window and looked out on the autumnal yard, with its little curve of footpath to the kitchen door. "What smells so strong of roses in this room?" she said presently. She sniffed hard. "I don't smell anything but these nutmegs." "It is not nutmeg." "I don't smell anything else." "Where do you suppose Agnes is?" "Oh, perhaps she has gone over the ferry to Porter's Falls with Addie. She often does. Addie's got an aunt over there, and Addie's got a cousin, a real pretty boy." "You suppose she's gone over there?" "Mebbe. I shouldn't wonder." "When should she be home?" "Oh, not before afternoon." Rebecca waited with all the patience she could muster. She kept reassuring herself, telling herself that it was all natural, that the other woman could not help it. But she made up her mind that if Agnes did not return that afternoon, she should be sent for. When it was 4 o'clock, she started up with resolution. She had been furtively watching the onyx clock on the sitting-room mantel. She had timed herself. She had said that if Agnes was not home by that time, she should demand that she be sent for. She rose and stood before Mrs. Dent, who looked up coolly from her embroidery. "I've waited just as long as I'm going to," she said. I've come way from Michigan to see my own sister's daughter and take her home with me. I've been here ever since yesterday, 24 hours, and I haven't seen her. Now I'm going to. I want her sent for." Mrs. Dent folded her embroidery and rose. "Well, I don't blame you," she said. "It is high time she came home. I'll go right over and get her myself." Rebecca heaved a sigh of relief. She hardly knew what she had suspected or feared, but she knew that her position had been one of antagonism, if not accusation, and she was sensible of relief. "I wish you would," she said gratefully, and went back to her chair, while Mrs. Dent got her shawl and her little white head tie. "I wouldn't trouble you, but I do feel as if I couldn't wait any longer to see her," she remarked apologetically. "Oh, it ain't any trouble at all," said Mrs. Dent as she went out. "I don't blame you. You have waited long enough." Rebecca sat at the window, watching breathlessly until Mrs. Dent came stepping through the yard alone. She ran to the door and saw, hardly noticing it this time, that the rose bush was again violently agitated, yet with no wind evident elsewhere. "Where is she?" she cried. Mrs. Dent laughed with stiff lips as she came up the steps over the terrace. "Girls will be girls," said she. "She's gone with Addie to Lincoln. Addie's got an uncle who's conductor on the train and lives there, and he got 'em passes, and they're going to stay to Addie's Aunt Margaret's a few days. Mrs. Slocum said Agnes didn't have time to come over and ask me before the train went, but she took it on herself to say it would be all right, and why hadn't she been over to tell you?" Rebecca was angry, though not suspicious. She even saw no reason for her anger. Oh, she was putting up grapes. She was coming over just as soon as she got the black off her hands. She heard I had company, and her hands were a sight. She was holding them over sulfur matches. "You say she's going to stay a few days?" repeated Rebecca dazedly. "Yes, till Thursday," Mrs. Slocum said. "How far is Lincoln from here?" "About 50 miles. It'll be a real treat to her. Mrs. Slocum's sister is a real nice woman. It is goin' to make it pretty late about my goin' home. If you don't feel as if you could wait, I'll get her ready and send her on just as soon as I can," Mrs. Dent said sweetly. "I'm going to wait," said Rebecca grimly. The two women sat down again, and Mrs. Dent took up her embroidery. "Is there any sewing I can do for her?" Rebecca asked. Finally, in a desperate way, "If I can get her sewing along some—" Mrs. Dent arose with alacrity and fetched a mass of white from the closet. "Here," she said, "if you want to sew the lace on this nightgown. I was going to put her to it, but she'll be glad enough to get rid of it. She ought to have this and one more before she goes. I don't like to send her away without some good underclothing." Rebecca snatched at the little white garment and sewed feverishly. That night, she wakened from a deep sleep a little after midnight and lay a minute trying to collect her faculties and explain to herself what she was listening to. At last, she discovered that it was the then popular strains of the Maiden's Prayer floating up through the floor from the piano in the sitting room below. She jumped up, threw a shawl over her nightgown, and hurried downstairs, trembling. There was nobody in the sitting room. The piano was silent. She ran to Mrs. Dent's bedroom and called hysterically, "Emmeline! Emmeline!" "What is it?" asked Mrs. Dent's voice from the bed. The voice was stern, but had a note of consciousness in it. Who was that playing The Maiden's Prayer in the sitting room, on the piano? I didn't hear anybody. There was someone. I didn't hear anything. I tell you there was someone, but there ain't anybody there. I didn't hear anything. I did. Somebody playing The Maiden's Prayer on the piano. Has Agnes got home? I want to know. Of course Agnes hasn't got home, answered Mrs. Dent with rising inflection. Be you gone crazy over that girl? The last boat from Porter's Falls was in before we went to bed. Of course she ain't come. I heard. You were dreamin'. I wasn't. I was broad awake. Rebecca went back to her chamber and kept her lamp burning all night. The next morning, her eyes upon Mrs. Dent were wary and blazing with suppressed excitement. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then frowning and setting her lips hard. After breakfast, she went upstairs and came down presently with her coat and bonnet. Now, Emmeline, she said, I want to know where the Slocums live. Mrs. Dent gave a strange, long, half-lidded glance at her. She was finishing her coffee. Why? She asked. I'm going over there and find out if they have heard anything from her daughter and Agnes since they went away. I don't like what I heard last night. You must have been dreaming. It don't make any odds whether I was or not. Does she play The Maiden's Prayer on the piano? I want to know. What if she does? She plays it a little, I believe. I don't know. She don't half play it anyhow, she ain't got an ear. That wasn't half played last night. I don't like such things happening. I ain't superstitious, but I don't like it. I'm going. Where do the Slocums live? You go down the road over the bridge past the old grist mill. Then you turn to the left. It's the only house for half a mile. You can't miss it. It has a barn with a ship in full sail on the cupola. Well, I'm going. I don't feel easy. About 2 hours later, Rebecca returned. There were red spots on her cheeks. She looked wild. I've been there, she said, and there isn't a soul at home. Something has happened. What has happened? I don't know. Something. I had a warning last night. There wasn't a soul there. They've been sent for to Lincoln. Did you see anybody to ask? Asked Mrs. Dent with thinly concealed anxiety. I asked the woman that lives on the turn of the road. She's stone deaf. I suppose you know. She listened while I screamed at her to know where the Slocums were, and then she said, Mrs. Smith don't live here. I didn't see anybody on the road, and that's the only house. What do you suppose it means? I don't suppose it means much of anything, replied Mrs. Dent coolly. Mr. Slocum is conductor on the railroad, and he'd be away anyway. And Mrs. Slocum often goes early, When he does, to spend the day with her sister in Porter's Falls. She'd be more likely to go away than Addie. "And you don't think anything has happened?" Rebecca asked, with diminishing distrust before the reasonableness of it. "Land, no!" Rebecca went upstairs to lay aside her coat and bonnet, but she came hurrying back with them still on. "Who's been in my room?" she gasped. Her face was pale as ashes. Mrs. Dent also paled as she regarded her. "What do you mean?" she asked slowly. "I found when I went upstairs that little nightgown of Agnes's on the bed, laid out. It was laid out. The sleeves were folded across the bosom, and there was that little red rose between them. Emmeline, what is it? Emmeline, what's the matter?" "Oh!" Mrs. Dent was struggling for breath in great choking gasps. She clung to the back of a chair. Rebecca, trembling herself so she could scarcely keep on her feet, got her some water. As soon as she recovered herself, Mrs. Dent regarded her with eyes full of the strangest mixture of fear and horror and hostility. "What do you mean talking so?" she said in a hard voice. "It is there." "Nonsense! You threw it down and it fell that way." "It was folded in my bureau drawer." "It couldn't have been." "Who picked that red rose?" "Look on the bush," Mrs. Dent replied shortly. Rebecca looked at her. Her mouth gaped. She hurried out of the room. When she came back, her eyes seemed to protrude. She had in the meantime hastened upstairs and come down with tottering steps, clinging to the banisters. "Now I want to know what all this means?" she demanded. What means?" "The rose is on the bush, and it's gone from the bed in my room. Is this house haunted, or what?" "I don't know anything about a house being haunted. I don't believe in such things. Be you crazy?" Mrs. Dent spoke with gathering force. The color flashed back to her cheeks. "No," said Rebecca shortly. "I ain't crazy yet, but I shall be if this keeps on much longer. I'm going to find out where that girl is before night." Mrs. Dent eyed her. "What be you going to do?" "I'm going to Lincoln." A faint, triumphant smile overspread Mrs. Dent's large face. "You can't," said she. "There ain't any train." "No train?" "No, there ain't any afternoon train from the Falls to Lincoln." "Then I'm going over to the Slocums again tonight." However, Rebecca did not go. Such a rain came up as deterred even her resolution, and she had only her best dresses with her. Then, in the evening, came the letter from the Michigan village which she had left nearly a week ago. It was from her cousin, a single woman, who had come to keep her house while she was away. It was a pleasant, unexciting letter enough, all the first of it, and related mostly how she missed Rebecca, how she hoped she was having pleasant weather and kept her health, and how her friend, Mrs. Greenaway, had come to stay with her since she had felt lonesome the first night in the house. How she hoped Rebecca would have no objections to this, although nothing had been said about it, since she had not realized that she might be nervous alone. The cousin was painfully conscientious, hence the letter. Rebecca smiled in spite of her disturbed mind as she read it. Then her eye caught the postscript. That was in a different hand, purporting to be written by the friend, Mrs. Hannah Greenaway. informing her that the cousin had fallen down the cellar stairs and broken her hip and was in a dangerous condition, and begging Rebecca to return at once, as she herself was rheumatic and unable to nurse her properly, and no one else could be obtained. Rebecca looked at Mrs. Dent, who had come to her room with the letter quite late. It was 9:30, and she had gone upstairs for the night. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Mr. Amblecrom brought it," she replied. "Who's he?" "The postmaster. He often brings the letters that come on the late mail. He knows I ain't anybody to send. He brought yours about your coming. He said he and his wife came over on the ferry boat with you." "I remember him," Rebecca replied shortly. "There's bad news in this letter." Mrs. Dent's face took on an expression of serious inquiry. "Yes, my cousin Harriet has fallen down the cellar stairs. They were always dangerous. And she's broken her hip, and I've got to take the first train home tomorrow." "You don't say so. I'm dreadfully sorry." "No, you ain't sorry," said Rebecca, with a look as if she leaped. "You're glad. I don't know why, but you're glad. You've wanted to get rid of me for some reason ever since I came. I don't know why. You're a strange woman. Now you've got your way, and I hope you're satisfied." "How you talk!" Mrs. Dent spoke in a faintly injured voice, but there was a light in her eyes. "I talk the way it is. Well, I'm going tomorrow morning, and I want you, just as soon as Agnes Dent comes home, to send her out to me. Don't you wait for anything. You pack what clothes she's got, and don't wait even to mend them, and you buy her ticket. I'll leave the money, and you send her along. She don't have to change cars. You start her off when she gets home, on the next train." "Very well," replied the other woman. She had an expression of covert amusement. "Mind you do it." "Very well, Rebecca." Rebecca started on her journey the next morning. When she arrived 2 days later, she found her cousin in perfect health. She found, moreover, that the friend had not written the postscript in the cousin's letter. Rebecca would have returned to Ford Village the next morning, but the fatigue and nervous strain had been too much for her. She was not able to move from her bed. She had a species of low fever induced by anxiety and fatigue. But she could write, and she did, to the Slocums, and she received no answer. She also wrote to Mrs. Dent. She even sent numerous telegrams with no response. Finally, she wrote to the postmaster, and an answer arrived by the first possible mail. The letter was short, curt, and to the purpose. Mr. Amblecrom, the postmaster, was a man of few words, and especially wary as to his expressions in a letter. "Dear Madam," he wrote, "your favor reeked. No Slocums in Ford's Village, all dead. Addie 10 years ago, her mother 2 years later, her father 5. House vacant. Mrs. John Dent said to have neglected stepdaughter. Girl was sick. Medicine not given. Talk of taking action. Not enough evidence. House said to be haunted. Strange sights and sounds. Your niece, Agnes Dent, died a year ago, about this time. Yours truly, Thomas Amblecrom.